Good evening and welcome to All About Money. I'm your host, Dhruv Tikekar. This week we're going to be focusing on the findings of a report by Women Beyond Walls, a platform dedicated to ending the over-incarceration and over-criminalization of women around the world. Their latest report has found that there is a major funding problem when it comes to supporting organizations that are providing everything from legal services to mental health support and education for this community. Well, joining me from Zambia to talk about this is Sabrina Mahtani. She's a curator at Women Beyond Walls. She's also a lawyer and activist who's worked with incarcerated women for more than 15 years now. Sabrina, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Well, I just wanted to start by getting a sense of the impetus behind publishing this report. Because it draws on accounts from dozens of organizations across dozens of countries, obviously. So how did this all come together, and how and why did you narrow it down to the funding aspect specifically of this clearly overlooked issue?
Yes, thank you. So I've been working in the sector for over 15 years with a variety of organizations across the world. And this issue around lack of funding has always been one that's been so major, and it's been a key challenge from organizations from Sierra Leone even to more wealthier countries such as the UK. And so we decided to actually, get some data and to further into this issue. And so we, put out this survey. And the survey had responses from 34 organizations from 24 countries spanning 5 continents. And we focused more on the global south. So we had 32 responses from organizations working in Africa and 21% in Asia. And this is the first report of its kind. And we really hope that it's going to provide some really kind of stark statistics, but to start a dialogue around, funding for this very marginalized group. But also some really fundamental work is being done. So we think it's an exciting opportunity for donors and investors to really try and look further into funding some of this important work.
So diving into the details of this report, the organizations that the report is referring to are working obviously with incarcerated women, but many of them don't necessarily have the scale perhaps needed to address the problems that many of them are facing around the world. Could you paint us a picture of what these NGOs or charities are like, and maybe even what their operational structure is like?
Absolutely. So many of these organizations are really established. 74% have been in operation for over 10 years. So these are organizations that have been doing really fundamental work for a long time. They're well known. But they're actually operating on small to medium annual size budgets. About 52% operate with less than $500,000 a year. So they're doing really fundamental work, but actually on a small scale budget. And the majority of organizations, over 60%, operate them with less than 20% staff. So again, doing really important work, but with a small team. And I think critically, these organizations are working in a really holistic way. They're working with women at all stages of the criminal justice system, from the pre-trial stage, whilst they're incarcerated, and also when they're released. And they're also working to change things on a systemic basis, trying to make justice systems more gender responsive, trying to limit women coming into contact with the justice system in the first place by kind of trying to change some of the drivers around women's incarceration. And over half of the organizations were either led by or had women who had lived experience of the justice system themselves involved in the work. And I think that's really critical. When we're talking about women's incarceration, we must always center, the voices and experiences of women who've had this experience themselves. So you can see here that there's actually, some really kind of important work being done. And if I could maybe share some of the things that these organizations are doing, one organization is an organization of feminist lawyers, and they're providing legal support to women. And they freed 6 women who would have been on death row without their support. Another one is providing support to women when they're released, helping them to find jobs and to settle back into society again. Another one is led by a very inspiring woman who is formerly incarcerated herself, and providing peer support to women, helping them to get bail, to make sure that they don't spend, weeks or years in pretrial detention. So they're doing really, really important work.
And obviously, helping them through crucial stages of their incarceration process as well, and following that too, which makes, the funding all more important for these causes. But I just wanted to get a sense of the sources of this funding. Where do these main streams come from? Maybe you could name a couple of them for us, maybe across the global south, perhaps.
Yeah, so most of the organizations do get resources from philanthropic sources. So, for example, foundations or donors. But there are a number of challenges which we can perhaps unpack later. But there's very limited funding opportunities that actually focus on the work that they're doing. These application processes are very complicated. They're not accessible. So, that is a huge challenge. And interestingly, 50% rely on individual donations and fundraising events to get the money they need. But this is very precarious. I mean, we know during COVID that many people don't have the amount of money that they did before, so they're not able to support charitable causes. Or in COVID, you can't go out and do fundraising events, actually. Only 44% of respondents actually had any government funding. And I think this is really telling. I mean, the government has an obligation to resource this work, to make sure that there are legal services being provided, there are other services, but they're not investing the resources in this work. And then only 21% received funding from multilateral organizations such as the United Nations in the past 2 years. And so again, I think this reflects just the wider lack of prioritization around women's incarceration.
And we know obviously now where this funding is coming from, but what about within the organizations themselves? Do they have a lot of financial padding when it comes to maybe tiding over tough times like COVID-19 or the pandemic, for example? How are they managing around their existing finances?
That's a really good question. And 79% of organizations had reserves or savings of less than 6 months of their annual budget. I mean, this puts them in a really vulnerable position. Often, donor funding can be delayed or it can be very slow. You might have big gaps while you're trying to get more funding when one kind of grant ends. And as you mentioned, particularly during the pandemic or any other kinds of emergencies, if you only have less than 6 months of reserves, it means that it's very, very difficult for you to actually, keep this work going. And I think, this was very telling. Many of the organizations, the majority, are facing very precarious funding situations. 26% said they may not be able to operate next year due to lack of funds, and 30% said they'd have to make cuts but would survive. So this is a really urgent situation where we really need to look at it and to make sure that there is some new funding being provided for these organizations.
Well, despite the urgency, one of the big takeaways from the report, at least, was that donors just don't see this as a high priority issue. It's especially when it's stacked against perhaps other issues like poverty or gender-based violence and harassment. Firstly, why is that the case? And are we wrong, perhaps, to compare these different issues when they're clearly addressing different parts of society and dealing with different communities as well? So is it fair to compare them as well?
I think it's really difficult to authoritatively say why the funding's not prioritized. And I think one of our key recommendations is actually we would love to have a dialogue with donors and with groups working with and for incarcerated women and girls to hear about challenges from both sides. But I will say, I think from my own experience and having worked in this sector for a very long time, I think what particularly influences this is that there's very negative perceptions about incarceration, both in society and in the media, and I think this does influence what donors want to fund. Many incarcerated women have complex narratives. Research has shown that poverty, violence, abuse, mental health issues, these are the driving factors behind women coming into contact with the law. And often donors will want, if I can say, an ideal victim, someone that they can kind of market to their investors. And many of the issues that donors fund, such as gender-based violence or combating gender-based violence, is exactly the same issue that will impact incarcerated women. But these budgets will not include incarcerated women. And if I can perhaps give an example, sure. I worked on a case in Sierra Leone of a woman who was on death row. And she was on death row because she had killed her abusive partner in self-defense. He was beating her. There's a long history of abuse there, and she stabbed him to protect herself. Now, the judge didn't accept the self-defense argument, often because justice systems are not gender responsive. And the organization I was working with took on this case. It took 9 years. They filed an appeal, and eventually she was released. Now, that's a very complex story and perhaps something that donors wouldn't want to fund. But also, as you can see, a lot of this work is complex. It can take a long time. And so donors do need to invest in it. And often they want kind of quick wins or kind of short turnarounds. And I think the fact that incarcerated women are often excluded from mainstream feminist movements. So they're excluded from convenings, they're excluded from gatherings. It means that they don't have the same access to donors, they don't have the same access to networks. I mean, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, a key principle there is leave no one behind. So there is an impetus to actually fund those who are most excluded, those who are most marginalized. And in many of the cases of incarcerated women, society has failed them on a number of bases. So I think actually there is a real impetus that we must prioritize this group of women. We must support this work.
I find it really unusual that while gender-based, organizations that are working with around gender-based violence and harassment are receiving this kind of financial support, that these organizations that perhaps are dealing, as you'd mentioned, with women who perhaps were acting in self-defense and have been jailed for the same, that they're not receiving the adequate support they need. Why this paradox of sorts in these scenarios?
I mean, I think it was really telling for us that 71% of organizations did not receive funding from donors that identify themselves as women's rights or feminist donors. And this, I think, is just reflective of, again, the wider mainstream feminist movement not kind of really considering these issues around women's incarceration. And perhaps for some of the same reasons I mentioned before, because there's so much negative perception, there's stigma, we want to focus on the ideal victim. But I also think it's because, and I think this is really at the heart of what Women Beyond Walls is trying to do, is that, people don't go into prisons. They're places we can ignore. We don't need to, think about what happens to women who are incarcerated because we don't see it. It's not visible, as with some of the other kind of societal issues. And because of a lot of stigma, many women, when they're released, they're very reluctant to speak about their experiences. I have to say there are some incredibly brave and courageous women who are speaking out, who are running organizations and doing amazing work. But I think a key example of this was the Generation Equality Forum that happened this year. Now, this was billed as the biggest gathering on women's rights since, the Beijing conference in 1995. And, it was organized by UN Women. There were so many different organizations there. The topic of women's incarceration was not featured. And there were many opportunities where it could have been featured and it just wasn't. And I think that for me is just really telling that, this is not just about donors, this is about the wider women's movement. And I think we need to do a lot of work. And that's what we hope this report may do. It's a very small contribution, but we want it to start this bigger dialogue and conversation. So we're very grateful to you for even, giving some more attention to this issue, because I think unless we get more publicity and spotlight on what's happening, then it will just continue to be ignored.
Sabrina, we obviously have a lot more to get to, but stay tuned. We'll be right back.